30 frames per second action with unstable performance and repetitive QuickTime events. Genji 2 was a launch title for the PS3 and seemed pretty keen on giving us a preview of the kind of boogeymen that would haunt a good deal of the generation ahead. If Genji 1 was a shining example of the charming mid-budget PS2 title, a game that lacked in scope but had a solid enough foundation in its core play to be entertaining regardless, then Genji 2 represents the opposite. An overambitious next-gen mess that skimps on the fundamentals to try and dazzle with a level of scope that there was not the time or perhaps even engine available on hand to properly realize. Something just feels totally off with the combat here compared to the original. Moves feel sluggish. I usually like to come off all smart, discussing combat in depth, how the implementation of certain moves or mechanics affects the player's engagement with play, but here it's really just a case of things feeling bad. Benkei, once a pretty fun tank character in the first game, now has such long wind-ups on his moves that I barely wanted to touch him. Same for the two new playable characters, Shizuka, who smacked our balls together in the last game, and Lord Buson with his elaborate spear moves. Their moves are so slow and deliberate, but feel lacking in impact and effects to justify that. Not that I'd want 3 of the 4 playable characters to be deliberate, slow strongmen, even if they did though. For most of the title I stuck to the original game's protagonist, Yoshitsunu, who is the fastest and has the most mobility, but even he feels a little less responsive than he once did. I was struggling to pull off his signature enemy hop move, and I think the worse performance plus the now slower response time on characters contributed to that. But there's an even bigger problem at play. I think on this channel I go pretty easy on 3D cameras. I always like to give games the benefit of the doubt. Like, maybe it was my fault, maybe there was a better vantage point I didn't make use of. Genji 2's camera though is just unacceptable. It's almost always zoomed in and angled towards the ground, and you have no way to adjust it. The game has to resort to a minimap radar to tell you where anybody is, and you better be checking it before you get decked by a guy hiding in the foreground. Not that the minimap is going to help much to tell you, when enemies are winding up attacks. The question is, what is the point of me trying to do aerial combos or aerial hops when I can't even see them up there? They're a struggle to pull off when I can't see what I'm doing. The camera is too zoomed in and isn't going to move up to track the moves. There are of course exceptions, where the camera decides that for an area it wants to be stuck looking upwards instead. Just as annoying, but in a different way. What's worse is that Genji 2 wants to have these huge battlefield levels, where you're taking on an army in a big open area, running around trying to take out captains, while fighting huge hordes, like in Dynasty Warriors or something. The problem is, we're not playing as super powerful Dynasty Warrior type characters who can waste giant waves of enemies. We're playing as these sluggish jokers. So when you're in these types of levels, swamped by enemies, the camera is so zoomed in that you can't see anything, and you can barely get 2 moves off, you're bound to get owned. Your saving grace will be your Kamui power, which, while very powerful, has unfortunately been reworked from the first game to be much less engaging. In the original, activating Kamui would slow time, allowing you to time counter moves more effectively. Now when you use it, it just triggers a series of QuickTime events in a massive void, and it gets old real fast. Sure, Kamui in the original would give you a button prompt, but it was still an extension of basic gameplay. You were doing the same counter moves you could do without Kamui, just slowed down so they were easier to pull off. And even with the button prompt popping up, it still wasn't all that easy to pull off against tougher enemies. Here it's a snooze fest. Hit the buttons, get the damage, go back to what you were doing. It's so much less involving. Genji 2's best attribute is probably its visuals, right? It's hard to compare to the previous game when each one is on such different hardware. I'm personally not big on the sequel cranking up the bloom effect so much and blowing out the image, and seeing them forego the original's 60 frames per second target for whatever this is a shame, but there's no denying that Game Republic have a knack for striking environments that are sufficiently detailed and dense, but also clean and not overly messy, both in terms of color and assets. Time and money was clearly spent on the pre-renders, which must have been fun to render out without having to compress them down to a PS2 disc for once. There's some cool looking areas that I wouldn't mind soaking up and exploring. Except, problem time, all of the more lavish outside areas that invite your imagination to wonder as to what's out there are usually linear short segments, and whenever the game sticks you in one area for a couple of hours to explore and piece a maze together, it ends up being a series of corridors. Hey bro, Just let me save. These dungeon-like areas can be absolutely infuriating. Backtracking back and forth down the same halls, platforming segments that if you fail, teleport you to a room with enemies on the other side of the level. It's as classic as it gets. Love how this grapple point doesn't register that you've grabbed it when you're standing on this platform, even if the grapple hook literally touches the grapple point. No, you see, you have to chance a stilted jump towards it, and then it lets you connect. Great. Genji 1 was a good example of how a few bells and whistles can help you get more invested in a game's setting. There weren't many levels in the game. There was like 2 towns and a couple of castles and mountain areas. But by letting you travel around in your own time between them, picking a destination on a map, letting you return to town at your own discretion to stock up on items and weapons, allowing you to go back to older areas to find hidden stuff, it helped make you feel like you were taking ownership of this journey through an actual place, with a population and safe havens and dangerous roads. Here they ditch all of that for just a linear succession of levels, and I think giving the player more freedom to adventure would have helped a game like this a lot, that doesn't have the deepest or most satisfying combat, and could have done with letting some of its prettier levels breathe more. The soundtrack is no surprise, an assault of Eastern strings, drums, and flutes, that, you know, is fitting enough. It can even risk getting you excited about the fight at times, until you use Kamui and the music has to abruptly stop for some chanting. Every time, sucking out all the tension the battle music was trying to drum up. Why not just let the battle track play over it? Would that have been a problem? I also had subtitles on for this one. All the Japanese terms and names combined with the sound balance at times made it hard to parse certain things.
Don't look at me. You're the one who ran for my arms.
Come again? The game's combat does have some compelling features, of course. You can now switch characters mid-gameplay, plus the game incentivizes you to switch by giving each character their own health pool. There's some mild combo potential with this if you really try hard to engineer it, and can find some breathing room amidst all the enemies to try. You know, when there's not guys hiding in the foreground like there usually is. You can also switch back and forth between 2 weapons of your choice with each character. Each character can get 5 weapons each, and they all have slightly different moves and abilities. But the differences are pretty minimal with a few exceptions, and you have to grind out XP to get them to the highest damage output, which isn't very exciting, especially when you get a fresh one that isn't leveled up, and know that if you want to use it at all, you're about to have to dump all the XP you've been saving into it. The stat-based progression of the original wasn't super compelling either, but I think it lent to some trickier decision-making. You could at least get risky by trading defense for attack power, or sell healing items to get stronger weapons sooner. Here there is a choice involved when deciding whether to level up health or how long the Kamui mode lasts, but upgrading Kamui always feels a bit deflating. It's like, yeah, it's going to make the game easier, but it also means I'm going to be stuck in the QuickTime dimension longer. The last piece of the puzzle is the story, which didn't do a whole lot for me either. The Heishi clan is back with new evil magic power, and it's up to Yoshitsune to rally up a gang to go stop them. I said that the 4th Onimusha could have done with more development and interplay between the cast to justify its friendship saves the day climax, but the team in Genji 2 makes Dawn of Dreams look like a Final Fantasy game by comparison. The weirdest twist is that the body of a villain from the first game, Kagekiyo, gets possessed by a god, Buson, and becomes a playable character. Don't know what that's about. Maybe they thought they made this historical figure look like too much of a knobhead in the last game and wanted to balance his image out in a contrived way. Or maybe this concept is based on some folklore I don't know about. Or maybe they just wanted a spear guy playable, and there he was for the taking. It leads to a very weird moment. So this level has you replaying boss fights from game 1. Pretty bold of them to pull this card only halfway into their second game, but okay. This leads to an odd battle where you can fight the villain from the last game as the villain from the last game. I think these superpowered Japanese history games can be guilty of coasting a bit on the fame their characters already have. The Genji games especially, not really doing much to develop these people and their relationships to make them interesting to fresh eyes. Maybe if I had learnt about these figures in school like the Japanese audience probably did, the novelty of these guys doing air combos would be enough to get me invested. Maybe if Guy Fawkes was a secret boss doing backflips and shooting lasers in Onimusha, I wouldn't need much extra context for that to get my attention. I didn't think I'd have to do Genji 2 like this, but I played it and was really disappointed. I thought about skipping making this video altogether, and just casually mentioning that in some other video down the line, but unfortunately so many things are wrong that was just not going to cut it. I still recommend the first Genji for action fans if you can get it, without breaking the bank too much, but I wouldn't go out of your way for this unless you stumble on it real cheap and want the complete Genji series in your collection. Perhaps Genji 2 fell victim to a tight deadline, the PS3's launch. It came out only about a year and a half after the original game on entirely new hardware, and perhaps at the end the focus was on polishing the thing up to look good in screenshots, rather than honing the quality of the core play. Coming out as a PS3 launch title also means it fell victim to some weirdo quirks, such as not featuring rumble since the PS3 didn't have that when it first came out. Instead, to compensate, there's a 6-axis motion-controlled dodge available, if you really want to spice up the difficulty. Maybe hold the controller upside down too while you're at it. Fortunately, Game Republic would go on to release another game on the PS3 shortly after Genji 2 in 2007 that would focus more on their strengths. With Folklore, a title that did let their compelling environments breathe a little more. But with that, our little look back at the warring samurai action games of the 2000s comes to a close. Who won in the end, Onimusha or Genji? Well, nobody, because ultimately both of these series got buried underneath far more polished action titles with far more spectacle and compelling characters. Move over to now though, and samurai action games have hit the big time. In the last few years, we've seen some huge critical and commercial successes. If I were to look at games like Sekiro or Ghost of Tsushima and notice at least one major thing that separates them from Genji or the Onimusha sequels, is that these newer titles focus more on the solitary experience of being a samurai, with their playable hero wandering the land alone. They spoke to the appeal of traveling and exploring by yourself, surviving as this lone wolf, while Onimusha and Genji decided that the way to grow their series was to start basing the games around these large teams palling about. And I think that ignored some of the appeal of the subject matter that later samurai games would tap into. Anyway, I guess I'll see you in Ireland.